The evening sun hung low over the Wyoming plains, painting the horizon in shades of copper and gold. Ethan Cole sat in his handmade oak rocking chair, the wood worn smooth by 40 years of use. His weathered hands rested on the Winchester Model 1873 rifle across his lap, a rifle that had once been a wedding gift from a man who hated him. The metal had lost its shine decades ago, but Ethan kept it oiled and ready the way he had been taught in his youth. At 72 years old, Ethan's body bore the marks of a life spent working the land. His hands were thick and scarred, his face lined like a topographical map of hard winters and hotter summers. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp as ever, still held the clarity of a man who had learned to see what mattered. The screen door creaked open behind him. Samuel, his 15-year-old grandson, stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea condensation already forming on the sides. The boy had his father's build, tall and lean, but he had inherited something of Ethan's quiet intensity. He had just graduated from the local high school and would be heading to Denver for university in the fall, the first Cole to attend college. "Here you go, Grandpa," Samuel said, handing over one of the glasses. Ethan took it with a nod of thanks, feeling the coolness against his palm. The boy settled into the other rocking chair, the one Grace had insisted they buy, when the grandchildren started visiting regularly. Samuel had been quiet all afternoon, the kind of thoughtful silence that meant questions were forming. Sure enough, after a few minutes of shared quiet, Samuel spoke. "Grandpa, I was looking at the photographs in the parlor today, the ones on the mantel." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's one with you and 2 women. I know one is Grandma Rebecca, but the other woman, I've never heard you talk about her. Who is she?" Ethan took a slow sip of his tea, feeling the sweetness on his tongue. His gaze drifted toward the gate at the far end of the property, barely visible now in the gathering dusk. That gate. Everything had started there 40 years ago. 40 years that felt like both a lifetime and a single afternoon. "That's a long story, Samuel." "I've got time," the boy replied. Ethan set his glass down on the small table between them. The ice clinked softly. He had known this conversation would come eventually. All the grandchildren asked about the photographs sooner or later, but most accepted simple answers. Samuel was different. Samuel wanted to understand. "You want to know how a man can love twice in one lifetime?" Ethan asked. "How loss doesn't always mean the end of hope." Samuel nodded, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he was no longer looking at the Wyoming ranch of 1915. He was seeing the same land as it had been in 1875 when he had been 32 years old and certain he would never feel anything again. "The woman in that photograph," Ethan began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man settling into a story that needed to be told right, "is your Grandma Grace. And she came into my life on an evening much like this one. August 15th, 1875. I was 32 years old and I had been alone for 5 years." Samuel shifted in his chair, getting comfortable. Ethan took another sip of tea, gathering the threads of memory, and began. The summer of 1875 had been brutal. The kind of summer that baked the moisture out of everything, turning the grass brittle and the soil to dust. Ethan had spent the day repairing fence posts on the southern boundary of his land work that left his shoulders aching and his hands raw, despite the calluses he had built up over years of ranch work. He was 32 years old, but he felt ancient. 5 years of solitude had a way of aging a man from the inside out. His wife Rebecca had left him in the summer of 1870, taking nothing but a single carpet bag and leaving behind a note that said only, "I cannot do this anymore. Forgive me." For 5 years, Ethan had lived in a house that echoed with absence. He woke before dawn, fed his cattle, mended fences, fixed buildings, ate alone, read his Bible, and went to sleep. The next day, he did it all again. No laughter, no conversation beyond what was necessary with Dan Cooper, the ranch hand who helped with the heavier work. No hope that tomorrow would be different from today. The fence post he had been working on was made of fresh pine timber cut from trees that grew in the higher elevations. He had used a 3-pound forged hammer to drive the nails, each strike precise and measured. The barbed wire he strung between the posts was good quality, steel expensive but necessary. Cattle were not smart animals, but they learned quickly where the boundaries were if you made them clear enough. His tools were laid out on the ground beside him in the order he would need them. The hammer, the bag of hand-forged nails, the wire cutters, the leather gloves to protect his hands from the barbs. In his belt holster rode his Colt 45 Peacemaker loaded with 6 rounds. A man alone on the Wyoming frontier did not go unarmed, even on his own land. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Drive the nail, string the wire, test the tension, move to the next post. He had 150 head of Hereford cattle depending on these fences to keep them where they belonged. At $18 a head, those cattle represented his entire livelihood. Lose them to wandering or rustlers, and he would lose everything. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when he saw the figure at his gate. At first, it was just a silhouette dark against the bright sky, too small to be a man on horseback. Not the right shape for a wagon. Ethan straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Strangers rarely brought good news, especially strangers who arrived on foot. He gathered his tools, methodical even in his caution, and began walking toward the house. As he got closer to the gate, the figure became clearer. A woman, he realized, wearing a dusty traveling dress, a single leather valise at her feet. She stood with her shoulders squared, despite obvious exhaustion, like someone who had come a long way and was determined to finish the journey properly. When he was close enough to make out her features, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes, blue-green, the color of deep water. He had seen those eyes every day for 3 years of marriage, had watched them fill with tears. When she told him about the baby, had searched them desperately for some sign of what he had done wrong when she left. But these eyes did not belong to Rebecca. They belonged to her younger sister. "Who goes there?" Ethan called out, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to anyone since Dan had left for the day at noon. The woman lifted her head, meeting his gaze directly. "Ethan, don't you recognize me? I'm Grace. Grace Mitchell." Ethan stopped walking. Grace Mitchell, Rebecca's younger sister. He had not seen her since Rebecca's funeral, and that had been 5 years ago. No, wait, that could not be right. Rebecca was not dead. Rebecca had left him. His confusion must have shown on his face because Grace spoke again, her voice gentle. "May I come in? It's been a long journey from San Francisco." Ethan's mind was moving slowly, still processing the impossibility of her presence. What was Rebecca's sister doing here? The Mitchell family had made their feelings about him perfectly clear after Rebecca left. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had sent one letter filled with accusations and barely concealed contempt, and then cut off all communication. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. Grace picked up her valise. "I came to forgive you both." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Ethan stood frozen, unable to form a response. Forgive for what? Rebecca was the one who had left. He was the one who had been abandoned, left to figure out what he had done wrong while his wife disappeared into the city with her wealthy family. Grace waited patient in the face of his silence. Finally, years of ingrained hospitality won out over confusion. He pushed open the gate. "Come in then," he said gruffly. "I don't have much to offer in the way of comfort these days." "I don't need comfort," Grace replied. "Just a place to rest for a bit." He led her up the path to the house, acutely aware of how small and plain it must look to someone who had grown up in the Mitchell mansion in San Francisco. The house was 3 rooms built from pine timber he had cut and milled himself. The foundation was stone laid by hand. The roof was cedar shingles replaced every 5 years to keep out the weather. It was clean. He kept it that way, partly out of pride and partly because there was not much else to do with his evenings. But it was bare of any feminine touch. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no flowers in vases or decorative items on the shelves. Just the necessities. Table, chairs, stove, lamp. Grace stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. Ethan watched her take it in, trying to see it through her eyes. The wide plank pine floor, 12-inch boards he had laid himself. The cast-iron Acme Charter oak stove, number 8, the best he could afford at the time. The oak dining table, solid and handmade, 6 legs because he had wanted it to last. The glass-fronted gun cabinet holding his Winchester, his 12-gauge shotgun, and his Sharps rifle. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs at the table. "I'll get water heating." He worked in silence, pumping water from the well into a tin pitcher. The well was 60 feet deep, dug by hand over the course of 2 months. The water was cold and clean, the best on this part of the range. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, adding wood to bring the fire back to life. Grace had taken a seat at the table, removing her gloves. Her hands were pale and delicate compared to his own weathered paws. City hands, hands that had never strung barbed wire or branded cattle. "You said you came to forgive us both." Ethan set his back still to her as he worked. "You need to explain what that means." Behind him, Grace was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "Rebecca is dead, Ethan." The words hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the stove, the heat from the cast iron burning his palms, but he barely felt it. His mind had gone blank, unable to process what he had just heard. When he managed to ask, not turning around, 3 months ago, consumption, it was quick at the end. Ethan closed his eyes. Rebecca, dead. The woman who had been his wife, who had shared his bed and his dreams, who had carried his child. Dead at 27 years old, and he had not even known. 5 years of anger did not evaporate with news of death. 5 years of wondering what he had done wrong, of replaying every conversation and every moment, searching for the thing that had driven her away. 5 years of telling himself he did not care anymore, that he had moved on. All of it still sat heavy in his chest, complicated now by grief for a woman he had never stopped loving, no matter how hard he had tried. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, finally turning to face Grace. The inadequacy of the words embarrassed him, but what else was there to say? Grace met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, without judgment. "Before she died, Rebecca told me everything, about what really happened between you two, about the baby she lost, about her fear that you would never forgive her for leaving after that." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "She never gave me the chance to help her through it. One day she was my wife. The next she was gone. Just a note." "I know," Grace said softly, "and for 5 years I hated you. We all did. My parents believed what Rebecca let us believe, that you had failed her somehow, that you had not been there when she needed you most." "Your family made their opinions quite clear," Ethan replied, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. He remembered Thomas Mitchell's letter, every word of it burned into his memory. Accusations of neglect, implications of cruelty, threats of legal action if he ever tried to contact Rebecca again. The kettle began to whistle. Ethan busied himself with preparing tea, grateful for something to do with his hands. He had no proper tea service, just 2 tin cups and a jar of loose tea leaves he bought from the general store in town once a month. He poured the hot water, let the tea steep, and brought both cups to the table. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup as if needing the warmth despite the heat of the day. "I didn't just come to tell you about Rebecca," she said. "I came because I needed to make peace with the past, for myself as much as for her memory." "And what about me?" Ethan asked. "What am I supposed to do with this peace you're offering?" "Whatever you choose," Grace replied. She reached into her valise and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with rough twine. "But first, there's something else you should know. These are yours. Rebecca wrote them over the years. She never sent them, but she gave them to me before she died and asked me to bring them to you." Ethan stared at the bundle. There were at least a dozen letters, maybe more. The paper had yellowed with age. He could see Rebecca's handwriting on the top envelope, the familiar loops and curves he had seen on shopping lists and occasional notes during their marriage. "I don't know if I want to read them," he said. "That's your choice," Grace said, placing the bundle on the table between them. "But I promised her I would deliver them." Outside, the sun had fully set. The house was lit only by the oil lamp on the table and the glow from the stove. In the dim light, Grace's face looked so much like Rebecca's that it hurt to look at her. The same cheekbones, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But there were differences too. Grace's jaw was stronger. Her gaze was more direct. Where Rebecca had been soft, Grace seemed solid. "How long can you stay?" Ethan asked. "I bought a return ticket for next week." "You're welcome to stay until then," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "The guest room is small, but it's clean." Grace looked at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been relief. "Thank you, I will help around the house. It's the least I can do." He showed her to the small bedroom at the back of the house. It was the room that was supposed to have been a nursery once, back when he and Rebecca had first started building their life together. Now it held only a simple iron bed frame, wool blankets, and a window that looked out over the garden plot Rebecca had started and Ethan had never had the heart to maintain. "I apologize for the lack of comfort," he said. "I don't need much," Grace replied. "Just somewhere to sleep." Ethan left her to settle in and retreated to his own room. The letter sat on his bedside table next to his Bible and the oil lamp. He stared at them for a long time. Part of him wanted to throw them in the stove unread. What good could come from reading the thoughts of a dead woman who had left him without explanation? What possible justification could there be for 5 years of silence? But another part of him, the part that had loved Rebecca Cole from the moment he first saw her at a church social in Cheyenne, needed to know, needed to understand. The grandfather clock in the main room struck 10. Ethan removed his boots. Good Red Wing leather that he had been wearing for 3 years and would wear for 3 more if he kept them oiled properly. He settled onto his bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. He picked up the first letter. The paper was brittle with age, the ink slightly faded. But Rebecca's handwriting was as clear as if she had written it yesterday. He began to read. "My dearest Ethan," the letter began, "I am in San Francisco, the Palace Hotel Room 304. Every fiber of my being wants to return to you, but I cannot. You do not understand what it is to lose a child the way I did. The doctor said I am like a house with no soul, that I may never bear children again. I see the way you look at me, Ethan. You do not say it, but I know. You want children. Every man wants children. And I cannot give you that. Better to set you free now than to watch you wither beside me day by day." Ethan's hands tightened on the paper. She had left because she thought she was doing him a favor. The logic was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong that he almost laughed. Except there was nothing funny about it. He read on. The second letter was dated 2 months after the first. Rebecca wrote about the depression that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. Some days she could not leave her bed. Her mother had called in doctors who prescribed laudanum and rest. She wrote about dreams where she was back in Wyoming, back in their little house, and woke up crying when she realized where she really was. The third letter, written 6 months after she had left, was shorter. She had seen a notice in the newspaper about cattle prices in Wyoming and wondered if Ethan's herd had done well that year. She hoped he was eating properly. She hoped he had found someone to help with the housework. The fourth letter, written a year after she left, contained a confession that made Ethan's chest tighten. She had dreamed about him with another woman. In the dream, he was smiling, genuinely happy, in a way he had never quite been with her. "That is what you deserve," she wrote. "Someone who can make you smile like that." The fifth and sixth letters were similar to the earlier ones, expressions of regret mixed with justifications for staying away. She mentioned that her father had told her Ethan was doing well, that he had moved on with his life. Ethan felt a flash of anger at that. Thomas Mitchell had never once contacted him to ask how he was doing. The old man had simply assumed, or perhaps lied to his daughter, to keep her in San Francisco. The seventh letter, dated 2 years after she left, was different. The handwriting was shakier, as if written by someone whose hands were not quite steady. Rebecca wrote about a realization she had come to. She had made a terrible mistake in leaving. But how could she face him out after abandoning him? How could she explain? The eighth letter mentioned her father's continued insistence that Ethan had moved on. Rebecca wrote that she hoped it was true, even as the thought of it broke her heart. The ninth and 10th letters covered 3 more years. Mentions of holidays spent wishing she were somewhere else. Descriptions of San Francisco society events that bored her. References to Grace, who was becoming a teacher despite their father's disapproval. The 11th letter was shorter than the others and written in a hand that shook badly. "I am sick, Ethan. The doctor says consumption. Perhaps this is God's punishment for what I did to you." Ethan had to stop reading. He set the letter down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Rebecca had been dying, and he had known nothing about it, had not even known she was ill. He forced himself to pick up the next letter. The 12th was dated 4 years after she had left. The deterioration in her handwriting was obvious. She wrote about pain and difficulty breathing. She wrote about regrets, about all the things she wished she had done differently. "Grace does not know the truth," she wrote. "She thinks you failed me. Please do not hate her for it. She is only trying to protect her sister." The 13th and 14th letters were brief, written when Rebecca clearly had little strength to spare. She wrote about wanting to see Wyoming one more time, about missing the sound of the wind through the grass and the sight of the mountains at sunset. The 15th and final letter was dated just 2 weeks before Grace had said Rebecca died. "My dearest Ethan," it began. "This will be the last letter I write to you, though, like all the others, I will not send it. The doctor says I have only weeks left, perhaps days. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away out of fear and foolishness. I am sorry. I am so, so sorry. Grace will bring these letters to you after I am gone. Please forgive me, and please be kind to her. She needs to be saved just as much as you do. I love you always and forever. Rebecca. The last line stopped him. She needs to be saved just as much as you do. What had Rebecca meant by that? Ethan set the letter down and realized his face was wet. He had not cried since the day Rebecca left, had not allowed himself that weakness. But now, alone in the dark of his bedroom with 15 letters scattered across the quilt, he wept. Not the loud gasping sobs of a younger man, but the quiet, steady tears of someone who has just realized the magnitude of what was lost. He could have saved her. If he had known, if he had understood, he could have gone to San Francisco, could have brought her home, could have found better doctors, could have held her hand through the illness, could have been there at the end. But he had not known. 5 years of anger and hurt pride had kept him from trying to find her. 5 years of telling himself he was better off alone. And now she was gone, and there was no way to make it right. The rooster crowed outside, announcing the coming dawn. Ethan realized he had been reading all night. His eyes burned with fatigue and tears. His body ached from sitting in one position for hours. But something inside him had shifted. The anger he had carried for 5 years had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something different. Grief, yes. Regret, certainly. But also a kind of understanding he had not possessed before. He washed his face in the basin of cold water he kept on his dresser, the water he had pumped from his well the previous evening. He changed into a clean linen shirt and made his way to the main room. Grace was already awake. She had found the coffee and started it brewing, the smell filling the small house. She was standing at the stove cooking eggs and bacon in the cast iron skillet. She looked up when he entered, and he saw that she understood immediately. His red-rimmed eyes must have told her everything she needed to know. "She never stopped loving me," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "No," Grace agreed quietly. "She never did." They sat down to breakfast in silence. The food was simple but well prepared. Grace clearly knew her way around a kitchen. They ate without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been building since the previous evening. "Did your parents know the truth?" Grace shook her head. "They only saw her suffering. It was easier to blame you than to accept that sometimes there are wounds no one can heal, that sometimes people make choices that do not make sense to anyone else." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that impulse. How much easier it was to have someone to blame than to accept the randomness of tragedy. "How long do you plan to stay?" he asked. "I had not thought that far ahead," Grace admitted. "My return ticket is for next week, but I have no pressing matters in San Francisco." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Ethan said. The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but they felt right. "You can help around the house if you want to feel useful. God knows there is enough work to do." Grace looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. "I would like that." Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn to tend to the cattle and work on the endless list of ranch tasks. Grace kept house, cooking meals and tackling projects that Ethan had been putting off for years. She washed curtains that had not been cleaned in 5 years. She scrubbed floors and organized shelves. She mended shirts and darned socks. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. At first, they spoke only of Rebecca, sharing memories and filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge. Ethan learned that Rebecca had spent her last months in relative peace, having made her confession to Grace and arranged for the letters to be delivered. Grace learned about the early days of Ethan and Rebecca's marriage, the happiness they had shared before loss and depression had torn them apart. But gradually their conversations expanded. Ethan learned that Grace had been engaged once to a banker's son in San Francisco. She had broken off the engagement when she discovered his gambling debts and his expectation that she would give up her teaching career to be a society wife. She had been supporting herself as a school teacher for 3 years, finding fulfillment in the work, but loneliness in her personal life. Grace learned that Ethan was not the rough, uneducated cowboy her parents had always depicted. He read extensively, everything from agricultural journals to poetry. He had taught himself to play the harmonica during long winter evenings. He treated his animals with care and his employees with respect. Dan Cooper, his ranch hand, was paid fair wages and given time off to visit his own family in town. On the fifth day of Grace's visit, a violent storm swept through the valley. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them winds that bent the grass flat and rain that fell in sheets. Ethan and Dan worked frantically to secure the buildings and move the cattle to higher ground. The creek that ran through the southern pasture could flood quickly in heavy rains, and Ethan had lost stock to flash floods before. By the time Ethan made it back to the house, he was soaked to the skin and breathing hard. A falling branch had caught him across the left arm, leaving a deep gash that bled freely down his sleeve. Grace met him at the door with a towel. "You are hurt." "It is nothing," Ethan said automatically. "Just a scratch." "Let me see." Her tone brooked no argument. She led him to the kitchen table and made him sit while she fetched clean linen for bandages, a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting, and needle and thread for stitching. Outside, thunder crashed, and lightning lit up the sky like daylight. Grace worked with steady hands, cleaning the wound with whiskey that stung like fire. Ethan clenched his jaw but made no sound. He had been raised to believe that a man did not show pain, especially not in front of a woman. "You are stubborn," Grace said quietly as she threaded the needle. "I cannot let a woman see me as weak." "Pain is not weakness, Ethan. It is simply being human." She began stitching 5 neat sutures with black cotton thread. Her hands were surprisingly steady. Ethan watched her face as she worked, noticing the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip slightly when she was focused. When she finished, she tied off the thread and wrapped the wound with clean linen. "There, that should hold." "Thank you," Ethan said. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Grace jump. Without thinking, Ethan reached out and took her hand in his. The contact was electric. Both of them froze, suddenly aware of the warmth of skin on skin, of the way her hand fit perfectly in his larger one. They were sitting close together, close enough that Ethan could see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender soap she used. "Grace," he said, his voice rough. "We should not," she whispered. But she did not pull her hand away. They sat like that as the storm raged outside, hands clasped, neither willing to break the connection. It felt like something forbidden, something dangerous. She was Rebecca's sister, his wife's sister. It was wrong to feel this pull toward her, wrong to notice the softness of her skin or the way the lamplight played across her features. But wrong or not, Ethan could not deny what he was feeling. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than numbness. For the first time since Rebecca left, he felt alive. The storm began to ease. The thunder grew more distant. The rain softened from a downpour to a steady drumming on the roof. Finally, Grace pulled her hand away and stood up. "It is late. I should go to bed." "Grace, wait," Ethan started. "Good night, Ethan," she said firmly, and disappeared into her room, closing the door behind her. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at his bandaged arm and the hand that had held hers. Outside, the storm continued its retreat. Inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having washed the air clean. Ethan found Grace in the kitchen early, a carpet bag sitting by the door. "You are leaving?" he asked, though he could see the answer clearly. "I think I should," Grace said, not meeting his eyes. "I will take the morning stage to town and catch the train tomorrow." "Because of last night." It was not a question. Grace finally looked at him, and he saw confusion and fear, and something else in her eyes, something that looked like longing. "Because if I stay, I do not know what will happen," she said, "and I am not ready to find out." Before Ethan could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Dan Cooper stepped inside, hat in hand, his face grim. "Boss, we have got trouble. Marcus Brennan is at the gate with the sheriff and Judge Harrison." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What does he want?" "He is saying you have been squatting on public land. Says he has got papers proving the southern section belongs to the county, not to you. Says you have been running cattle on it illegally for 5 years." Ethan turned to look at Grace, saw his own shock reflected in her face. The land dispute he had worried about for months had finally come to a head, and it was coming at the worst possible time. He grabbed his hat from the hook by the door and strode outside, Grace and Dan following close behind. At the gate, 3 men sat on horseback: Marcus Brennan, the banker who had been trying to buy Ethan's land for years; Sheriff Tom Wade, looking uncomfortable; and Judge Harrison, a weary old man who clearly did not want to be there. Marcus dismounted, pulling a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. He was 45 years old, well-dressed in a black suit that must have cost more than Ethan made in 6 months. His Morgan horse was the finest breeding stock, worth more than most men's annual wages. Cole, Marcus said, spreading a surveyor's map on the ground. You have been occupying 160 acres of public land for 5 years. This section here from Willow Creek to the Southern Hills. That is not your land. I have the homestead papers from 1868, Ethan countered. I paid my fees, worked the land for 5 years according to law. That land is mine. Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Your papers were based on an old survey map. We had a new survey done last year. It shows the actual boundary lines. The land you have been grazing your cattle on belongs to the county. Ethan felt cold rage building in his chest. This was a setup, a legal maneuver designed to steal land he had worked and improved for years. I built fences on that land, dug a well, put in irrigation. And the bank is prepared to compensate you fairly, Marcus said. $500 for your improvements. $500 for 5 years of back-breaking work. For the land he and Rebecca had planned to pass down to their children someday. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Mr. Cole, you have 30 days to provide proof of legal ownership. If you cannot, the disputed land will be put up for public auction. I can appeal this, Ethan said. You can, the judge agreed. But you will need a lawyer and documentation in time. All of which cost money Ethan did not have. Grace stepped forward, surprising everyone. The law protects honest homesteaders. Mr. Cole has rights. Marcus noticed her for the first time, his eyes sharpening with interest. And you are Grace Mitchell. Recognition flashed across Marcus's face. Mitchell, as in Thomas Mitchell of the California Trust Bank. Grace nodded, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Marcus's entire demeanor changed. His smile became genuine, almost ingratiating. A pleasure, Miss Mitchell. Your father and I have had some business meetings. I had no idea you were visiting this area. The implication was clear. Marcus wanted connections to the Mitchell fortune. This changed his calculations about Ethan significantly. After the men left with a warning that the 30-day clock was now running, Ethan, Grace, and Dan returned to the house. Dan poured himself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. He has been waiting for this, Dan said. Wants to run a rail spur from town up to the silver mines north of here. Your land sits right in the path. I am not giving up this ranch, Ethan said flatly. Rebecca and I built it from nothing. You need a lawyer, Grace said. Lawyers cost money. I have maybe $200 saved. That will not be enough, Dan said grimly. Grace hesitated, then spoke carefully. I could write to my father. He knows good lawyers. Perhaps he could help. No, Ethan's voice was hard. I will not beg favors from Thomas Mitchell. But Ethan, I said no. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Grace looked like she wanted to push back, but she bit her tongue. It was their first real disagreement, and it hung in the air between them like smoke. What will you do? She asked finally. Dan and I will go to the county land office tomorrow. We will pull the original survey maps and find every piece of documentation we can. If Marcus Brennan wants this land, he is going to have to prove his claim is legitimate, and I do not think it is. Why not? Grace asked. Because men like Marcus do not play fair. If he had real legal standing, he would have taken me to court years ago. This new survey, these convenient boundary changes, I am betting they are fabricated. I just have to prove it. After Dan left for the day, Grace began preparing dinner. Ethan watched her move around the kitchen, so at ease in his space now. It felt natural having her there. Felt right in a way that scared him. I thought you were leaving, he said. Grace paused in her work, not turning around. I was. But now you have this legal trouble. I cannot just leave you to face it alone. I have faced worse alone. I know, but you do not have to anymore. The words hung between them, meaning more than they said. Ethan wanted to cross the room, wanted to turn her around and make her look at him, wanted to ask what was happening between them. But he did not. Instead, he stood and went outside to check on the animals. When he returned, Grace had set 2 places at the table. They ate in near silence, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on them both. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tell me about Rebecca, Grace said suddenly. Tell me about when you first met her. Ethan leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back. It was at a church social in Cheyenne. She was wearing a blue dress. She smiled at me, and I knew right then I was going to marry her. Was she happy in the beginning? I think so. We were happy together, at least until she lost the baby. Yes, Ethan's voice was quiet. After that, something broke in her. I did not know how to fix it. Did not even know it needed fixing until she was gone. It was not your fault, Grace said. Maybe not, but I should have seen it, should have done more. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Finally, Grace spoke again. What did Rebecca mean in her last letter when she said I needed to be saved too? Ethan had been wondering the same thing. I do not know, but I think she understood something about both of us, that we were both trapped in different ways. Me and my grief, you and your family's expectations maybe. Grace considered this. My parents wanted me to marry well, to be a society wife. They were furious when I became a teacher. Said it was beneath our family's station. But you did it anyway. I did. Though sometimes I wonder if I just traded one kind of loneliness for another. The honesty in her words made Ethan look at her closely. In the fading light, she looked tired and young and brave all at once. You are not lonely here, he said before he could stop himself. Grace met his eyes. No, I am not. Neither of them spoke about what that meant. They sat on the porch until the mosquitoes drove them inside, until the night grew too cold to remain outside comfortably. Grace retired to her room. Ethan lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the feel of her hand in his and what it might mean that Rebecca's last letter had brought her sister to his door. The next morning brought new purpose. Ethan and Dan rode to town early before the summer heat became unbearable. The county land office was a small building near the courthouse presided over by a clerk named Jeremiah Smith, who had held the position for 20 years. Ethan Cole, Jeremiah greeted him. Heard you had some trouble with Marcus Brennan. I need to see the original survey maps from when I filed my homestead claim, Ethan said. Jeremiah disappeared into the back room, returning with a leather-bound book and several rolled maps. 1868, you said. They spent 3 hours going through the records. The original survey clearly showed the boundaries Ethan had always believed were his. The land from Willow Creek to the Southern Hills was definitely included in his homestead claim. Where did Marcus get his survey? Ethan asked. Jeremiah shrugged. He brought in some surveyor from Denver, fellow named Thompson, claimed the old maps were inaccurate, that the markers had shifted or been moved over the years. That is convenient, Dan muttered. Ethan studied the maps more carefully. Jeremiah, who witnessed my original claim. The clerk checked his records. Judge Harrison and a settler named William Bradford. Bradford's still around. Last I heard he was farming land about 10 miles east of here. It was a lead. If Ethan could get sworn testimony from the original witnesses, it would support his claim. He thanked Jeremiah and left with Dan, his mind already working through the next steps. When they returned to the ranch, Ethan found Grace in the attic sorting through boxes of old papers. She looked up as he climbed the ladder dust, streaking her face. I thought I might find something useful up here, she explained. Some documentation that could help. Have you found anything? She held up a wooden box. This was under some old blankets. I think it might have Rebecca's things. Ethan took the books carefully. Inside were mementos from his life with Rebecca. Their marriage certificate, the deed to the land, bills of sale for their first cattle, and there at the bottom a letter from the land office confirming the exact boundaries of his homestead claim. This is it, Ethan said, feeling hope for the first time since Marcus had appeared at his gate. This confirms everything. The original survey was correct. Grace smiled and it transformed her face. Then you have a case. We still need to prove Marcus's survey is fraudulent, but this is a start. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw intelligence and determination and something that made his heart beat faster. Thank you, he said. For what? For being here, for helping, for not giving up on me even though you barely know me. Grace's expression softened. I know you better than you think, Ethan Cole. Rebecca's letters told me a lot, and these past days have shown me the rest. They climbed down from the attic together, and Ethan felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. The land dispute was serious. Marcus Brennan had money and influence. This fight was not going to be easy. But for the first time in 5 years, Ethan did not feel alone in facing his problems. Grace was here. She believed in him. And whether it was wise or not, whether it was proper or not, he was starting to believe in something too. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The following week passed in a blur of activity and tension. Ethan threw himself into gathering evidence for his land claim, riding out to find William Bradford, and securing a sworn affidavit confirming the original boundary markers. Dan spent his days tracking down every scrap of documentation related to the homestead, every receipt and record that proved Ethan had worked the land continuously for 7 years, not just the required 5. Grace remained at the ranch, and neither of them spoke about her leaving anymore. She had written to the boarding house in San Francisco, where she rented a room, asking them to hold her belongings. She had written to the school where she taught, requesting an extended leave of absence for family matters. She did not write to her parents, not yet. The house had changed with her presence. Small things at first, clean curtains that let in the morning light without the buildup of years of dust. The smell of bread baking in the oven, something Ethan had not experienced since Rebecca left. Wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table picked from the meadow behind the barn. The sound of humming as she worked a low, melodious tune that filled the empty spaces. Ethan found himself listening for that humming in the mornings. Found himself looking forward to meals, not because he was hungry, but because it meant sitting across from Grace, watching the way she concentrated when she cut her meat, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking about something. It was dangerous, this growing comfort between them. He knew it. She knew it. But neither seemed capable of stopping it. On the 8th day after the confrontation with Marcus of Brennan, Ethan received word that he needed to appear before Judge Harrison in 2 weeks to present his case. It was faster than he had expected, which meant Marcus was pushing hard. The banker wanted this resolved quickly before Ethan could mount a proper defense. That evening, Grace prepared a larger supper than usual. Roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, biscuits with honey butter apple pie made from fruit she had bought in town. It was the kind of meal a woman made when she was trying to comfort someone, and Ethan was grateful for it, even if he could not say so out loud. They were just sitting down to eat when they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Ethan tensed his hand and automatically moving toward where his gun belt hung by the door. Visitors at dusk were rarely good news, but when he looked out the window, he saw a Palomino mare, expensive tack, gleaming in the fading light. And riding her was Charlotte Brennan. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, Grace following close behind. Charlotte dismounted with practiced ease, her riding habit tailored and elegant, far too fine for a casual visit to a working ranch. She was 28 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with the confidence of a woman who had never wanted for anything. "Mr. Cole," she called out, her voice bright. "I hope I am not intruding." "Miss Brennan," Ethan replied, his tone carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." Charlotte tied her horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps. Her eyes took in Grace standing in the doorway, and something flickered across her face. Calculation, perhaps, or assessment. "I heard about the situation with my father," Charlotte said, directing her words to Ethan, but watching Grace from the corner of her eye. "I wanted to come apologize. He can be rather aggressive in his business dealings." "Rather aggressive is one way to put it," Ethan said. "Attempting to steal a man's land is another." Charlotte had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It is not stealing if the law supports the claim." "And does it support the claim?" "I am not a surveyor or a lawyer, Mr. Cole. I only know what my father tells me. But I also know he is not unreasonable. Perhaps there is a way to resolve this that does not require courts and judges." It was a peace offering of sorts, though Ethan suspected it came with strings attached. Before he could respond, Grace stepped forward. "And you are?" Charlotte asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Grace Mitchell, Mr. Cole's sister-in-law." The recognition was immediate. Charlotte's demeanor shifted, becoming warmer, more interested. "Mitchell as in the San Francisco Mitchells, the California Trust Bank." "My father is Thomas Mitchell, yes." "What a small world," Charlotte said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but small. "My father has mentioned your family's bank several times. He has great respect for your father's business acumen." She paused delicately. "Are you visiting the area for long?" "I have not decided yet," Grace replied, her own smile equally measured. The two women regarded each other with the kind of polite hostility that men often missed, but other women recognized instantly. Ethan felt like he was watching two chess players size each other up across a board. Charlotte turned her attention back to Ethan. My father is hosting a dinner on Saturday, just a small gathering, some of the town's leading citizens. He asked me to extend an invitation to you. It would be a good opportunity to discuss the land situation in a more civilized setting. She glanced at Grace. You are welcome to bring your guest, of course. I will think about it, Ethan said noncommittally. Please do. I think you will find my father much more reasonable over a good meal and wine than he is in formal legal proceedings. Charlotte moved toward her horse, then paused. It was a pleasure to meet you, Miss Mitchell. I do hope you will be staying in our little community for a while. We could use more refined society. After Charlotte rode away, Grace and Ethan stood on the porch in silence. Finally, Grace spoke. She is interested in you. I know. You should go to that dinner. Ethan looked at her surprised. Why would I do that? Because she might be able to influence her father. Because making an enemy of the Brennans will not help your case. Because she is appropriate for a man in your position. Appropriate, Ethan repeated, his voice flat. Yes, unmarried, connected, available. Everything I am not. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Charlotte Brennan, with all her money and connections, held no appeal for him whatsoever. But Grace had already turned and gone back inside, and the moment was lost. They ate dinner in strained silence, the earlier warmth of the evening gone. After the meal, Grace excused herself early, claiming tiredness. Ethan sat alone on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge one by one. The next morning brought a letter delivered by the post rider who came through once a week. Grace's name was written in an elegant hand on the envelope. She opened it at the breakfast table, and Ethan watched her face go pale as she read. What is it? He asked. Grace folded the letter carefully, her hand shaking slightly. My parents, they are coming here. What, why, Someone wrote to them, told them I was still in Wyoming staying with you. They are arriving on next week's train. She looked up and he saw real fear in her eyes. They are not happy, Ethan. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He could imagine exactly what Thomas Mitchell thought about his daughter staying unchaperoned at the ranch of the man he blamed for Rebecca's unhappiness. They cannot force you to leave. You do not know my father. He is not a man who accepts defiance easily. You are 25 years old, Grace. You are not a child. To him, I will always be his daughter to command. And after Rebecca, she trailed off, but Ethan understood. Thomas Mitchell had lost one daughter already. He would not risk losing another, especially not to Ethan Cole. How long before they arrive? 6 days. 6 days to prepare for a confrontation Ethan knew was inevitable. 6 days for Grace to decide whether she would stand up to her parents or return to San Francisco with them. 6 days to figure out what was happening between them before outside forces made the decision for them. The atmosphere in the house grew tense as the days passed. Grace threw herself into housework with almost frantic energy, scrubbing and organizing and cooking, as if she could somehow make the ranch presentable enough to win her parents' approval. Ethan knew it was futile, but he let her try, understanding the need to do something, anything, when facing something you could not control. Dan noticed the change immediately. He pulled Ethan aside while they were mending fence on the third day. Boss, what is going on? You and Miss Grace, you are moving around each other like two cats in a too small barn. Her parents are coming. They do not approve of her being here. Dan nodded slowly. And you do not want her to leave. It was not a question. Ethan sighed, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. The summer heat was building, promising another scorching afternoon. What I want does not matter. She is Rebecca's sister, Dan. It is not right. Says who? Rebecca is gone. God rest her. You are alive. Miss Grace is alive. Why should two living people deny themselves happiness out of loyalty to the dead? Because it feels like betrayal. Does it, or does it feel like you do not deserve to be happy again? The question struck too close to home. Ethan turned back to the fence post he was setting, driving it into the ground with more force than necessary. Dan, wise enough to know when to leave things alone, returned to his own work without another word. That evening, Grace made rabbit stew with potatoes and herbs she had found growing wild near the creek. They ate in near silence, the awareness of the approaching deadline making conversation difficult. After dinner, Grace sat on the porch while Ethan checked on the animals one last time before full dark. When he returned, she was still there, staring out at the darkening landscape. He settled into the chair beside her. "Tell me about your father," he said. "Really tell me, what kind of man is Thomas Mitchell?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. "He is a man who believes the world can be controlled if you have enough money and influence. He loves his family in his way, but that love comes with expectations. Rebecca was supposed to marry well and produce grandchildren. When she married you instead," she glanced at him. "He never forgave you for taking her away from the life he had planned. And you, what does he expect from you? The same, a good marriage, a respectable life. I disappointed him when I became a teacher. In his view, Mitchell women do not work. We marry men who can provide for us. But you did it anyway." "I did, and he has been waiting ever since for me to come to my senses and return to being the dutiful daughter." She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Coming here, staying with you, it is his worst nightmare. Proof that both his daughters made poor choices." "Is it a poor choice?" Grace turned to look at him fully. In the dim light from the house, her eyes were dark and serious. "I do not know yet, Ethan. I only know that being here feels right in a way nothing else has for a very long time." He wanted to reach for her hand the way he had during the storm. Wanted to tell her that he felt the same way, that these past weeks had woken something in him he thought had died with his marriage. But before he could find the words, she stood. "I should sleep. Tomorrow I need to go to town for supplies. If my parents are coming, I want the house to be perfect." She went inside, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the night sounds of the ranch. An owl hooted in the distance. Cattle lowed softly in their enclosures. The wind whispered through the grass, all familiar sounds, but tonight they felt different. Tonight they felt like the calm before a storm. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Grace baked bread and pies, cleaned every surface until it gleamed, arranged and rearranged the few pieces of furniture to make the small house seem larger and more welcoming. Ethan and Dan worked on making the ranch look as prosperous as possible, repairing visible fence lines, organizing the tool shed, even giving the barn a fresh coat of whitewash. On the evening before the Mitchells were due to arrive, Grace could not sleep. Ethan heard her moving around in her room, then the creak of the floorboards as she walked to the kitchen. He found her sitting at the table, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill, staring at nothing. "Could not sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. "I keep thinking about what I am going to say to them, how I am going to explain why I stayed. Tell them the truth, which is," Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her, "that you came here to deliver your sister's letters, that you stayed to help a man facing legal troubles, that there is nothing improper about it. And is that the truth, Ethan? Is there nothing improper about this?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan could lie, should lie. But looking at Grace across the table, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the lamplight, he found he could not. "I do not know," he admitted. "I know what people might think. I know what your parents will assume. But when I am with you, when we are working together or sitting on the porch or just existing in the same space, it does not feel wrong. It feels like the first right thing to happen in 5 years." Grace's breath caught audibly. "Ethan, I am not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know who you are, what you mean to Rebecca's memory, but I also cannot lie to you, not about this. What do? We face tomorrow. We tell your parents the truth as we understand it, and then we see what happens." Grace reached across the table and after a moment's hesitation took his hand. Her skin was cool, her grip firm. They sat like that until the lamp oil ran low and the flame began to sputter. Then without a word, they both rose and went to their separate rooms. But Ethan knew, and he suspected Grace did too, that something had shifted between them. Whatever happened when the Mitchells arrived, they could not pretend anymore that this was just a sister-in-law helping with her brother-in-law's problems. The train from San Francisco arrived at precisely 2 in the afternoon as scheduled. Ethan and Grace stood on the platform in Hartwell, watching the passengers disembark. Thomas and Eleanor Mitchell were impossible to miss. Thomas Mitchell was 60 years old, tall and distinguished with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a three-piece suit that probably cost more than Ethan made in 6 months, carried a silver-handled walking stick that was more status symbol than necessity, and radiated the kind of authority that came from years of making people do what he wanted. Eleanor Mitchell was 55, dressed in the latest fashion from Paris, a traveling suit in deep purple with elaborate embroidery. Her hat was adorned with feathers that probably came from some exotic bird. She wore gloves despite the heat and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had been trained from birth to be conscious of appearances. They spotted Grace immediately. Thomas's face went from stern to thunderous when he saw Ethan standing beside her. Eleanor's expression was harder to read, a careful mask of disapproval mixed with concern. "Grace," Thomas said, his voice clipped, "get your things. We are leaving on tomorrow's train." Not hello, not how are you. Just the assumption that his daughter would obey without question. Grace straightened her spine. "Hello, Father, Mother. This is Ethan Cole." "We know who he is," Thomas said, not even looking at Ethan. "Grace, I said get your things." "I am not leaving tomorrow," Grace replied, and Ethan heard the tremor in her voice even as she tried to sound firm. Thomas finally turned his attention to Ethan, and the look he gave him could have frozen water in July. "You have some nerve, Cole. First you ruined one daughter's life, now you are trying to ruin another's." "Father, that is not fair," Grace protested. "Worshayut." Thomas's voice rose, drawing attention from other people on the platform. "What is not fair is finding out my daughter has been living unchaperoned and with the man at his isolated ranch for nearly 3 weeks. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Eleanor laid a hand on her husband's arm. "Thomas, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." They ended up in the ranch wagon. The drive back to the property conducted in tense silence. Grace sat between her parents in the back, while Ethan drove, feeling the weight of Thomas Mitchell's stare on the back of his neck the entire way. When they arrived at the ranch, Thomas looked around with barely concealed disdain. The house was small and plain, the barn functional but unremarkable. To a man who owned a mansion in San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhood, this working ranch must have seemed like poverty. "You have been living here?" Eleanor asked Grace, her tone suggesting she could not quite believe it. "Yes, Mother. It is a good house. Ethan built it himself." "How quaint," Eleanor replied in a tone that made it clear she found it anything but. Inside was no better. Despite Grace's efforts to make everything perfect, the house was still just 3 rooms with basic furnishings. Thomas took it all in with the expression that grew darker by the minute. Grace had prepared the best meal she could manage. Cold roasted chicken, fresh bread, pickled vegetables, pie for dessert. She set the table with Ethan's simple dishes and served the food with shaking hands. They sat down to eat, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Thomas blessed the food with a prayer that felt more like an indictment, asking God to guide his daughter back to wisdom and proper behavior. Then he picked up his fork and fixed Ethan with a stare. "Cole, I want to understand something. What exactly are your intentions toward my daughter?" "Father," Grace protested. "It is a fair question, Grace. You have been living here unchaperoned for weeks. Naturally, there are assumptions." Ethan set down his own fork, meeting Thomas's gaze steadily. "Grace came here to deliver letters from Rebecca. She stayed to help me with a legal matter regarding my land. There has been nothing improper." "The very situation is improper," Thomas said. "A young unmarried woman living with a man alone. It does not matter what has or has not happened. What matters is what people will assume." "Then people will assume wrong," Grace said firmly. Eleanor spoke for the first time since they had sat down. "Grace, dear, you must see how this looks. What respectable man will want to marry you after this? You have compromised yourself." "I am not trying to catch a husband, Mother. I have a career as a teacher. I am perfectly capable of supporting myself." Thomas made a dismissive sound. "This teaching nonsense needs to stop. You are a Mitchell. You should be married to a man of standing, not working like some common woman." "Like Rebecca was supposed to marry someone you chose," Grace shot back, and Ethan could see she instantly regretted it. Thomas's face went red. "Rebecca married beneath her station, and look how that turned out. She died alone and miserable because she made a foolish choice." "That is not true," Grace said, her voice rising to match her father's. "Rebecca died because she was sick, because she made herself sick with guilt and regret over leaving a good man who loved her." "How dare you?" Thomas began, but Grace cut him off. "I have the letters, Father. 15 letters Rebecca wrote over 5 years. Letters where she explained everything. Where she admitted that leaving Ethan was the biggest mistake of her life. Where she took full responsibility for her own choices." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at his daughter, his mouth working, but no sound coming out. Eleanor had gone pale, one hand pressed to her chest. "Letters," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, letters Rebecca gave me before she died and asked me to bring to Ethan. Letters that explain why she left what she was going through, how much she regretted it." Grace stood, went to the sideboard where she had placed the bundle, and brought them back to the table. "Read them. See for yourselves what really happened." She placed the letters in front of her parents and sat back down. Thomas picked up the first one with trembling hands, and Eleanor moved her chair closer so they could read together. Ethan watched as Thomas and Eleanor Mitchell read their dead daughter's words. He saw Eleanor's eyes fill with tears, saw Thomas's stern expression crack and crumble, saw them exchange looks of horror and guilt and grief as they realized how badly they had misjudged the situation. When they finished, Thomas set the letters down carefully as if they might shatter. His voice when he spoke was hoarse. "She was ill. The depression, the consumption. And we did not know. We blamed you, Cole, when we should have been helping her." "You could not have known," Ethan said quietly. "Rebecca hid it well. But we should have seen, should have asked more questions." Thomas looked at Ethan, really looked at him for the first time. "I owe you an apology. A profound one. I spent 5 years hating you for something that was not your fault." Eleanor was crying openly now, delicate sobs that she tried to muffle with her handkerchief. "My poor girl, my poor, poor girl." Grace moved to comfort her mother, and Ethan found himself sitting across from Thomas Mitchell, the man who had despised him for half a decade, watching understanding and regret play across his features. "Why did Grace really stay?" Thomas asked after a long moment, his voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. Ethan considered lying but found he could not. "At first, to help with my land troubles. Marcus Brennan is trying to claim part of my property using a questionable survey. Grace found documents that has supported my claim. And now, why is she still here now?" This was the dangerous question, the one Ethan had been dreading. He looked across the room to where Grace sat beside her mother and found her looking back at him. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what they both knew was true. "You would have to ask her that," Ethan finally said. Thomas followed his gaze, and Ethan saw the moment the older man understood. Saw realization dawn, followed quickly by a complex mixture of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and underneath it all, a deep weariness. "This is not acceptable," Thomas said, but there was less force behind it than before. "I know how it looks. Do you, my daughter, living with her dead sister's husband? Can you imagine what society will say?" "I can, but I also know what I feel, and I think Grace knows what she feels. Whether we act on those feelings or not is something we are still figuring out." "That is not good enough," Thomas said, but he sounded more tired than angry now. "Grace is all we have left. I will not lose another daughter. I would never hurt her. You say that now, but Rebecca thought you would not hurt her either, and look what happened." Rebecca hurt herself," Ethan replied more sharply than he intended. "She made a choice based on fear and despair, and I could not stop her because I did not know what she was thinking. But I learned from that, Mr. Mitchell. I learned that communication matters, that honesty matters, that you cannot save someone who does not tell you they need saving. Grace is not Rebecca, and I am not the man I was 7 years ago." Thomas studied him for a long moment. Then to Ethan's surprise, the older man nodded slowly. "We will stay a few days," he said. "Eleanor will want time to grieve properly now that she knows the truth. And I need to observe you and Grace together. I need to see if what I suspect is actually happening. And if it is, then we will deal with it properly, with consideration for what is right and what society demands." Thomas's voice hardened slightly. "But make no mistake, Cole. If you compromise my daughter's reputation, if you do anything that could harm her future, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. Land trouble with Brennan will seem like a minor inconvenience compared to what I can bring down on your head. Am I understood?" "Perfectly." They regarded each other across the table, not quite enemies anymore, but not quite allies either. Then Eleanor called for Thomas, needing him, and the moment broke. That night, Ethan gave up his room for the Mitchells and made a bed for himself in the barn. It was not comfortable, but it was proper, and propriety mattered now more than ever. As he lay on a pile of hay with a blanket listening to the horses move in their stalls, he thought about the events of the day. The Mitchells knew about Rebecca's letters now. They understood that Ethan had not failed their daughter, that circumstances beyond anyone's control had led to tragedy. It was a kind of vindication, he supposed. But it did not feel triumphant. It just felt sad. And now they knew, or at least suspected, about him and Grace. Thomas had made his position clear. He would not stand in the way if things were done properly. But what did properly mean in this situation? How did you court your dead wife's sister without it seeming wrong? The next morning, Eleanor insisted on visiting Rebecca's grave. There was a small cemetery outside Hartwell, where Rebecca had been buried when her body was brought back from San Francisco. Ethan had been to the grave only once, shortly after the funeral, and had not returned since. The memories were too painful, the guilt too heavy. But he took them all now, driving the wagon with Grace beside him and her parents in the back. The cemetery was peaceful, shaded by cottonwood trees with a view of the mountains in the distance. Rebecca's headstone was simple granite with her name and dates carved into it. Eleanor knelt beside the grave, weeping. Thomas stood with his hands on his wife's shoulders, his own eyes wet. Grace hung back, giving her parents space to grieve. Ethan found himself standing at the foot of the grave, looking at the stone and feeling strange. He had mourned Rebecca in his own way over the years, but that mourning had been mixed up with anger and confusion. Now knowing the truth, understanding why she had left, the anger was gone. What remained was just sadness for a life cut short, for potential, never realized, for love that had not been enough to overcome illness and despair. "I am sorry," he said quietly to the grave. "I am sorry I could not save you. Sorry I did not understand. Sorry for everything." Grace moved to stand beside him, and without thinking about it, their hands found each other. It was Thomas who noticed first, looking up from comforting his wife to see his youngest daughter holding hands with his former son-in-law at his eldest daughter's graveside. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thomas stood, helping Eleanor to her feet. "We should go," he said, his voice carefully neutral. The ride back was silent, heavy with unspoken things. When they arrived at the ranch, Thomas asked to speak with Ethan privately. They walked out toward the southern pasture, away from the house where Grace and Eleanor remained. "I will ask you one question," Thomas said when they were far enough away not to be overheard, "and I want an honest answer. Do you love my daughter?" Ethan had known this question was coming, but he still was not prepared for how much it cost to answer honestly. "I am trying not to," he said, "trying to tell myself it is wrong, that it is too soon, that people will not understand. But yes, I think I do." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out over the land. "Grace is all Eleanor and I have left. Losing Rebecca nearly destroyed us. If we lose Grace too, in any way, I do not know if we will survive it." "I understand. Up and then. Do you?" Thomas turned to face him fully. "Then you understand that if you pursue this, if you and Grace decide to make something of what is clearly developing between you, it must be done correctly, properly. No scandal, no whispers. You will court her formally with chaperones. You will propose marriage if and only if she agrees, and you will treat her with the respect and care she deserves." Ethan felt hope kindle in his chest despite his efforts to contain it. "You are saying you would not oppose it. I am saying I have already lost one daughter to stubbornness and pride. I will not lose another. If Grace chooses you, if she decides she wants to build a life here, then I will accept it. But it will be done right, Cole. No more living under the same roof unchaperoned. No more giving people reason to talk. If you want my daughter, you will earn her the right way. And if she does not want me," Thomas almost smiled, "then you will have to accept that. But somehow I do not think that is going to be the problem." They walked back to the house and Thomas called a family meeting. Grace looked nervous as they all gathered in the small parlor. Eleanor had composed herself, though her eyes were still red from crying. "Grace," Thomas began, "your mother and I have discussed the situation. We understand now what brought you here and why you stayed. We also understand that something more may be developing." He held up a hand when Grace started to protest. "Please let me finish. You are 25 years old, capable of making your own decisions. But you are also our daughter, and we care about your well-being and reputation. So here is what is going to happen." He laid out terms that were surprisingly reasonable. Grace could stay in Wyoming if she chose, but she would need to find proper lodging in town. If Ethan wished to court her, he would do so publicly and properly with appropriate chaperones. There would be no more living arrangements that could be misconstrued. If after a suitable period of courtship, they both wished to proceed to marriage, Thomas and Eleanor would give their blessing, albeit reluctant. However, Thomas concluded, there is one more thing. This land dispute with Marcus Brennan. I have some influence even out here. I will make inquiries, see if there are irregularities in his claim. I will not have my daughter's potential future husband cheated out of what is rightfully his. Ethan started to protest, but Thomas waved him off. Consider it penance for 5 years of misjudging you and insurance that if Grace does choose to stay, she will not be marrying a pauper who lost everything to a corrupt banker. That evening, they had a quieter dinner, the earlier tension replaced by a tentative peace. Eleanor asked Grace about her teaching, and for the first time seemed genuinely interested in hearing about it. Thomas questioned Ethan about ranching the cattle market, the challenges of working the land. It was almost normal, almost like a family getting to know each other. After dinner, Grace walked out to the barn, where Ethan was checking on the horses for the night. That went better than I expected, she said. Your father is a reasonable man when he wants to be. He likes you, or at least he respects you, I can tell. Ethan turned to face her. In the dim light of the barn with hay dust floating in the air and the warm smell of horses around them, she looked beautiful. Not in the polished way Charlotte Brennan was beautiful, but in a real honest way that made his chest ache. What do you want, Grace? He asked. Not what your parents want, not what society expects. What do you want? She stepped closer, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he dared. I want to stay. I want to see where this goes. I want to stop feeling guilty for being happy when my sister is dead. Rebecca wanted this for us. She said so in her letter. I know, but knowing it and feeling it are different things. They stood in the barn, not quite touching the space between them, charged with possibility. Finally, Grace stepped back. My parents are leaving tomorrow. They want me to come to town with them find a boarding house. Will you visit me there? Every day if you will let me. She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. Then I will let you. The next day, the Mitchells left for town with Grace and most of her belongings. Ethan helped load the wagon, hyper-aware of Thomas watching his every interaction with Grace. But when they said goodbye, Ethan simply tipped his hat and said he would call on her the following afternoon. Proper and respectful, just as Thomas required. After they left, the house felt empty in a way it had not since before Grace arrived. Dan found him standing in the kitchen, staring at the clean surfaces and neat arrangements that bore her stamp. She will be back, Dan said. I know. And you are going to marry her. I hope so, Dan grinned. Then we better make sure you do not lose this ranch to Marcus Brennan. A man cannot support a wife if he has got no land to work. They spent the next week preparing for the hearing with Judge Harrison. True to his word, Thomas Mitchell made inquiries. It turned out that the surveyor Marcus had hired a man named Thompson from Denver had been investigated for fraud in the past. Several of his surveys had been overturned for inaccuracies that suspiciously favored whoever had paid him. With this information and the documentation Ethan and Grace had found, the case began to look much stronger. Judge Harrison presented with proof of Thompson's questionable history, and Ethan's original homestead papers ruled in Ethan's favor. The land was his legally and unquestionably. Marcus Brennan would have to find another route for his railroad spur. Charlotte Brennan came to the ranch one final time after the judgment was announced. She found Ethan repairing the fence that ran along the disputed boundary. I came to apologize, she said without preamble. My father was wrong, and I supported him when I should have questioned the methods he was using. Apology accepted, Ethan said. I also came to say goodbye. I am moving to Denver. Father is opening a bank branch there, and I will be managing it. That is good. A fresh start. Charlotte smiled sadly. Yes, a fresh start. She looked at him for a long moment. She is lucky you know, Miss Mitchell. You are a good man, Ethan Cole. I hope she appreciates that. I am the lucky one. Perhaps you both are. Charlotte mounted her horse, then paused. Be happy. That is all any of us really want in the end. She rode away, and Ethan watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and gratitude. Then he turned back to his work, already thinking about his plans to visit Grace in town that afternoon. The courtship that followed was the talk of Hartwell for months. Ethan Cole, the widower rancher, courting Grace Mitchell, sister of his dead wife. At first there were whispers and sideways looks, but Grace faced them all with her head high, and Ethan conducted himself with such obvious propriety and respect that eventually even the worst gossips had to admit there was nothing scandalous about it. They took walks together, always with Eleanor or another respectable woman as chaperone. They attended church socials and town dances. Ethan brought her wildflowers and books he thought she might like. Grace taught him to dance properly and laughed when he stepped on her toes. Thomas and Eleanor stayed in Hartwell longer than they had planned, wanting to ensure their daughter was settled and happy. And as the weeks passed, even they had to admit that what was growing between Ethan and Grace was genuine and good. 2 months after Grace had first arrived at his gate with those letters, Ethan asked Thomas Mitchell for permission to marry his daughter. They were sitting in the parlor of the boarding house where Grace stayed, and Ethan's hands were sweating, despite his outward calm. "You love her," Thomas said. "It was not a question. More than I thought possible. And you will care for her, provide for her, treat her with the respect she deserves." "I will. I promise you that." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Then you have my blessing, such as it is worth." Ethan shook his hand, feeling like he had just won a battle he had not been sure he could win. That evening, Ethan took Grace for a walk to the edge of town, to a small hill that overlooked the valley where his ranch lay in the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was the same time of day she had first appeared at his gate, and Ethan thought about how much had changed in such a short time. "Grace Mitchell," he said, taking both her hands in his, "I know this is not conventional. I know people will talk. But I also know that life is too short to waste on fear and what-ifs. You came to my gate with forgiveness, and you gave me so much more than that. You gave me hope. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to believe in tomorrow. Will you marry me? Will you make that house into a home again?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that had been worn by 3 generations of Cole women. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for Grace. They stood on that hill as the sun set, holding each other, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt complete. The shadows of the past had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened, gentled by understanding and forgiveness. And ahead lay a future that, while uncertain, was filled with possibility. Grace looked up at him, her face radiant in the fading light. "I love you, Ethan Cole." "I love you too, Grace Mitchell," soon to be Grace Cole. They kissed as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had looked down on this land for millennia and would continue long after they were gone. But in that moment, under that vast Wyoming sky, 2 broken people had found a way to become whole again. And somewhere, Ethan liked to think, Rebecca was smiling. The wedding was set for September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before the autumn storms could make travel difficult. Grace and Eleanor threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that both amused and touched Ethan. He had expected a simple ceremony, something quiet given the unusual circumstances. But Eleanor Mitchell, having lost one daughter, was determined to see the other properly celebrated. "It will be small," Eleanor assured him when she saw his expression at the growing guest list. "Just family and close friends. Perhaps 70 people. 70 people seemed like half the territory to Ethan, but he kept his peace. If this was what Grace and her mother needed, he would endure it. The ceremony would be held at the small church in Hartwell, the same church where Ethan and Rebecca had been married 7 years earlier. Reverend Samuel Brooks, who had officiated then, would do so again now. When Ethan went to speak with him about it, he half expected judgment, or at least some expression of disapproval. Instead, the Reverend simply smiled. "Life does not follow the paths we expect, Ethan. I have learned that in 40 years of ministry. What matters is not what others think of your choices, but whether those choices bring you closer to love and to God. And from what I have seen, you and Grace have found both. You do not think it is wrong marrying Rebecca's sister. I think Rebecca is at peace, and I think you and Grace deserve to be at peace too. The living must not be bound forever by the dead, no matter how much we love them." It was the blessing Ethan had not known he needed. He left the church feeling lighter than he had in months. Grace chose to wear blue for the wedding, not white. It was a conscious choice and an acknowledgement that this was not a conventional first marriage for either of them. The dress Eleanor commissioned was beautiful, nonetheless, made of silk the color of a summer sky, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. When Ethan saw Grace in it for the first time on their wedding day, his breath caught in his throat. She stood in the doorway of the church, her arm linked with her father's, and she was radiant. Not in the fragile, ethereal way Rebecca had been beautiful, but with a strength and vitality that seemed to light her from within. Her eyes met his across the length of the church, and she smiled. That smile contained everything: nervousness and joy, hope and determination, love and promise. Thomas Mitchell walked his daughter down the aisle with visible emotion. Whatever reservations he might have had about this union had been set aside in favor of his daughter's happiness. When they reached the front of the church and Reverend Brooks asked who gave this woman to be married, Thomas's voice was strong and clear. "Her mother and I do." He placed Grace's hand in Ethan's, and for a moment the two men's eyes met. Thomas nodded slightly, a gesture of trust and blessing that meant more to Ethan than any words could have. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Ethan. He heard himself making vows, speaking words about honor and cherish and forsaking all others. He heard Grace's voice steady and sure, making the same promises. He felt the weight of his mother's ring as he slipped it onto her finger, the same ring she had worn since their engagement. And then Reverend Brooks was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Ethan was kissing his bride as the congregation erupted in applause. Grace Cole. She was Grace Cole now. His wife, his partner, his future. The reception was held in the town hall, which had been decorated with wildflowers and bunting. There was food and music, dancing and toasts. Dan Cooper gave a speech that managed to be both heartfelt and humorous, talking about how he had watched Ethan transform from a solitary grieving man into someone who smiled again. Eleanor wept delicate tears into her handkerchief. Thomas raised his glass and welcomed Ethan to the family officially and publicly. But the moment Ethan remembered most vividly was later in the evening when he and Grace danced together while the sun set outside the windows. She fit perfectly in his arms, moving with him as if they had been dancing together for years instead of months. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied. You. I feel like I have been given a gift I do not deserve." Grace pulled back slightly to look at him. "We both have. Rebecca gave us this, Ethan. She brought us together. The least we can do is be happy." "Then let us be happy." They danced until the musicians grew tired and the guests began to drift home. Then Ethan helped Grace into the wagon and they rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. Their ranch now. Their home. The house had been transformed in the months of their courtship. Grace had used some of her own money over Ethan's protest to add proper curtains and rugs, to replace worn furniture, and add touches of comfort and beauty. It was still modest, but it was warm and welcoming in a way it had not been in years. Ethan carried Grace over the threshold, a tradition he had not observed with Rebecca, and set her down gently in the main room. For a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just done. "This is real," Grace said softly. "We are really married." "We are." Ethan took her hands. "Grace, I need you to know something. I loved Rebecca. Part of me will always love her. But what I feel for you is different. Not less, just different. You are not a replacement for her. You are yourself, and I love you for who you are." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "I needed to hear that. I have been so afraid of being compared, of being found wanting." "Never. You could never be found wanting." He kissed her then properly, without the constraints of propriety or watching eyes. And later in the bedroom that had been his alone for so long, they came together as husband and wife, sealing their promises in the oldest way humans knew. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Grace continued teaching at the town school 3 days a week, riding in with Ethan when he had business to attend to, and staying with a family in town on the nights she taught late. The other days she worked on the ranch keeping house, but also learning the business side of cattle ranching, insisting that she should understand how their livelihood functioned. Ethan found himself consulting her on decisions about the herd, about which bulls to keep for breeding, about market timing for selling calves. She had a sharp mind for figures and a knack for seeing patterns he missed. Within months, the ranch was running more efficiently than it ever had. But beneath the contentment, Ethan sensed Grace wrestling with something. She would go quiet sometimes, staring out windows with a faraway expression. When he asked what she was thinking about, she would smile and shake her head, saying it was nothing. But he knew his wife well enough by now to recognize when she was keeping something to herself. The truth came out on a cold January morning, 4 months after their wedding. Ethan came in from feeding the animals to find Grace sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she was not drinking. She looked pale, almost frightened. Grace, what is wrong? Are you ill? No, not ill. She took a shaky breath. Ethan, I am with child. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. A child. Grace was pregnant. They were going to have a baby. Joy flooded through him, immediate and overwhelming. But it was followed just as quickly by cold fear. Rebecca had been pregnant once, had lost the baby in the 7th month, had been told by doctors that the trauma meant she would likely never carry another child to term, had fallen into a depression so deep it had ultimately driven her away, and years later contributed to her death. Grace saw all of this play across his face. I know, she said quietly. I know what you are thinking. What happened to Rebecca? Grace, I cannot lose you. You will not. You do not know that. Rebecca thought she would be fine. The doctors thought she would be fine. And then, he could not finish the sentence. Grace stood and came to him, taking his hands in hers. I am not Rebecca, Ethan. I am strong. I am healthy. And we will be careful. We will find the best doctor. We will follow every precaution. But I will not live in fear of something that might not happen. I am terrified, Ethan admitted. So am I. But I am also happy. We are going to have a baby, Ethan, a child of our own, something good coming from all the pain we have both endured. He pulled her into his arms, holding her, as if she might disappear if he let go. Promise me you will tell me if anything feels wrong. Any pain, any worry, anything at all. I promise. They wrote to Eleanor and Thomas that day, and the response came back within the week. Eleanor would come in the spring to help prepare, and they had already contacted a doctor in Cheyenne, a specialist in difficult pregnancies, who would see Grace monthly and be available for the birth. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Ethan found himself torn between joy and dread. He loved seeing her body change, loved feeling the baby kick under his palm when he held his hand to her swelling belly. But every day that passed was another day closer to the danger zone, to the 7th month when Rebecca had lost her child. Grace seemed calmer about it than he was, though he sometimes caught her with her hand on her stomach and a worried expression on her face. She continued teaching until the 6th month, when the school board gently suggested she should take leave until after the baby was born. She used the extra time to prepare the nursery sewing blankets and tiny clothes washing and organizing everything with meticulous care. Eleanor arrived in May when Grace was 7 months along. The older woman had aged visibly in the year since Rebecca's death and Grace's wedding, but she was determined to be present for the birth of her first grandchild. She and Grace worked together to stock the house with everything that might be needed, while Ethan and Dan prepared the ranch for his potential absence when the time came. The 7th month passed without incident. Then the 8th. Grace was healthy, the baby was active, and the doctor from Cheyenne pronounced everything normal when he examined her. But Ethan could not shake the fear that lurked in the back of his mind. On a warm evening in early June, Grace went into labor. It started with mild contractions in the afternoon, the kind the doctor had said could go on for hours or even days before active labor began. But by evening, they were coming faster and stronger. Ethan sent Dan racing into town to fetch the doctor while he and Eleanor helped Grace to the bedroom. It is too early, Grace gasped between contractions. The baby is not due for 3 more weeks. First babies often come early, Eleanor soothed, though Ethan could see the fear in her eyes. The doctor said as much. The labor went on through the night. The doctor arrived around midnight and examined Grace, declaring that everything seemed to be progressing normally. But as dawn approached and the contractions continued without the baby coming, his expression grew more concerned. She is not dilating as she should, he told Ethan quietly outside the bedroom door. If this continues much longer, we may have complications. What kind of complications? Exhaustion, hemorrhaging, fetal distress. The doctor's voice was clinical, but Ethan heard the worry underneath. We will give her until noon. If there is no progress by then, I may need to intervene. Ethan had never felt so helpless. He sat by Grace's bedside, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead, murmuring encouragements he was not sure he believed. She was so tired, her face gray with exhaustion, her grip on his hand weakening with each passing hour. Eleanor prayed in the corner, her lips moving silently but fervently. At 11 o'clock, Grace began to hemorrhage. Blood soaked through the sheets, too much blood, and the doctor's face went grim. He began working quickly, giving orders to Eleanor, applying pressure, trying to slow the bleeding. Ethan, Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. If you have to choose, save the baby. No. The word came out harsh, almost angry. No, Grace. Do not ask me to do that. Please, promise me. I will not lose you. I cannot lose you too. The doctor looked up from his work. Mr. Cole, I need you to leave the room. Now. I am not leaving her. You are in the way. Go. Eleanor gently pulled Ethan to his feet and led him from the room. He stood in the hallway, his back against the wall, listening to the sounds from inside. Grace's cries of pain, the doctor's calm instructions, Eleanor's soothing voice. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then cutting through everything else, a new sound. A baby's cry. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, her face streaked with tears, holding a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. You have a son, she said, her voice breaking. A healthy son. And Grace, the doctor is with her. She lost a lot of blood, but she is alive. She is going to be all right. Ethan took the baby with shaking hands. The infant was small, red-faced, and wrinkled with a surprisingly full head of dark hair. As Ethan looked down at his son, the baby opened his eyes and Ethan saw they were blue, the same shade as Grace's. Hello, he whispered. Hello, little one. I am your father. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, and wrapped tiny fingers around Ethan's thumb. The grip was surprisingly strong. When Ethan was finally allowed back into the bedroom, he found Grace pale and exhausted but smiling. The doctor had cleaned up most of the evidence of the difficult birth, though Ethan could see bandages and smell the metallic tang of blood. But Grace was alive. His wife was alive, and so was their son. Let me see him, Grace said weakly. Ethan placed the baby in her arms and watched as she counted fingers and toes, examined his face, traced the curve of his tiny ear. He is perfect, she breathed. So are you. I was so scared, she admitted. When the bleeding started, I thought about Rebecca, about how she never got to hold her baby. I thought I was going to die the same way. But you did not. You are here. You both are. They named him Benjamin Thomas Cole, honoring Grace's father and the reverend who had married them. Thomas, when he arrived 3 days later on the first available train, wept openly when he held his grandson for the first time. He is strong, Thomas said as Benjamin gripped his finger. He will do well. The weeks after Benjamin's birth were exhausting but joyful. Grace recovered slowly, her strength returning day by day. Ethan found himself amazed at how much one tiny human could disrupt every aspect of life. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, the endless cycle of diapers and crying, and brief moments of peace when the baby slept. But he would not have traded it for anything. One afternoon, about a month after Benjamin's birth, Eleanor was sorting through some of Rebecca's old belongings that had been stored in the attic. She called down to Grace and Ethan, her voice urgent. I found something. You both need to see this. They climbed up to find Eleanor holding a small leather journal, the kind ladies use for keeping diaries. It was dusty, clearly having been untouched for years. It was hidden in a hat box at the back, Eleanor explained. I think it is Rebecca's. Grace took the journal, carefully opening it to the first page. Rebecca's handwriting, unmistakable, dated from shortly after she had married Ethan. They brought it downstairs and read it together, sitting at the kitchen table while Benjamin slept in his cradle nearby. The early entries were mundane descriptions of daily life on the ranch, small observations about married life. But as they progressed through the journal, the entries grew more introspective. The entry dated shortly after Rebecca had lost her baby was heartbreaking. She described the physical pain, yes, but more the emotional devastation. The feeling that she had failed as a woman, as a wife. The doctor's pronouncement that she would likely never carry another child to term. The depression that followed, black and suffocating. But it was the entries from the final weeks before she left that stopped them all. Ethan does not know I am planning to leave, one entry read. I have not told him because I know he will try to stop me. He will say we can work through this together. But he does not understand. The darkness is too deep. I am drowning in it, and if I stay, I will pull him down with me. Better to leave now to set him free than to watch him waste away trying to save me. There were several more entries in this vein, each one revealing more of Rebecca's tortured reasoning. Then about a week before she actually left, an entry that made them all go still. I saw Grace today. She came to visit, and I watched her with Ethan. The way she made him laugh, the way she was not afraid to speak her mind to him, the way he looked at her, really looked at her like he saw someone worth listening to, and I thought she would be good for him. If I am gone, if something happens to me, Grace would take care of him. Grace is strong in all the ways I am weak. Grace could make him happy. The entry continued. I know it is a strange thought, perhaps even wrong, but I have been thinking about it more and more. If I am not here, Grace and Ethan could have the life I am incapable of giving him. They could have children, a real family. They could be happy together. And maybe that is what is supposed to happen. Maybe that is God's plan, even if I cannot see it clearly yet. Grace's hands trembled as she turned to the next entry dated just 3 days before Rebecca left. I have decided to write letters. Letters to Ethan explaining everything, but I will not send them while I am alive. I will give them to Grace when the time is right, when I know I am dying. She will bring them to him, and he will understand. And perhaps if God is merciful, those letters will bring them together. Perhaps some good can come from all this pain. I am writing Grace a separate letter too, one I will hide for her to find someday, telling her it is all right, telling her she has my blessing. Because if there is one thing I know, it is that love should not be wasted, and Ethan has so much love to give. There was one final entry dated the morning Rebecca left. Today I go. I am leaving behind the man I love and the life I wanted, but I am also leaving behind the possibility of something better for both of us. If Grace and Ethan find their way to each other, if they build the life I could not give him, then perhaps my leaving will not be entirely a tragedy. Perhaps it will be a gift, the only gift I have left to give. The three of them sat in silence when they finished reading. Eleanor was crying quietly. Grace had tears streaming down her face. Ethan felt like his chest had been cracked open. She knew, Grace whispered. All along she knew this might happen. She planned it. Not planned exactly, Eleanor said, but she hoped for it. She wanted you both to be happy, even if she could not be. Ethan reached for the journal, reading the entries again. Rebecca's words from 7 years ago, blessing something that had not yet happened, but that she had somehow foreseen. It was a final act of love from a woman who had been consumed by darkness, but had still managed to think of others. She gave us permission, Ethan said slowly. Before we even knew we needed it, she gave it. Grace placed her hand over his, and we honor her by being happy, by building this life together, by loving each other without guilt. That night, after Eleanor had retired and Benjamin was asleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch together. The summer air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Do you ever think about how strange life is, Grace asked? How the worst things can somehow lead to the best things. Rebecca's death brought me here. Her letters gave us a reason to talk. Her blessing gave us permission to love each other. I think about it often, Ethan admitted, and I think she understood something we did not. That love is not finite. That loving you does not diminish what I felt for her. That the heart has room for all kinds of love. I wish I could thank her. I think in a way we do thank her. Every day we are happy together. Every moment we appreciate what we have. That is our thanks. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, their son slept peacefully, a living symbol of hope and new beginnings. The years that followed were good ones. Benjamin grew strong and healthy, hitting every milestone right on time. 18 months after his birth, Grace became pregnant again. This time there was less fear, though Ethan still worried. The birth was easier, and twin girls arrived red-faced and loud in the spring of 1879. They named them Lucy and Emma after Ethan's mother and Grace's grandmother. The ranch prospered. With Thomas Mitchell's business connections and Ethan's hard work, they expanded the operation, increasing the herd and improving the quality of their breeding stock. They built additions onto the house, adding bedrooms for the growing family and a proper parlor for receiving guests. Grace continued teaching off and on, though now she focused on tutoring children who lived too far from town to attend the regular school. She found she could balance motherhood and teaching if she was creative about it, and the extra income helped fund improvements to the ranch. Thomas and Eleanor visited regularly, delighting in their grandchildren. The bitterness and judgment that had marked their early relationship with Ethan faded entirely, replaced by genuine affection and respect. Thomas often said that he had been wrong about many things in his life, but that he had never been more wrong than in his initial assessment of Ethan Cole. 3 years after the twins were born, Grace had another son, whom they named Michael. 4 children, a thriving ranch, a marriage built on love and respect and hard work. It was more than Ethan had ever dreamed possible in those dark years after Rebecca left. On a September afternoon in 1885, 10 years after Grace had first appeared at his gate, Ethan took his family on a trip. He had been saving money for months, planning it carefully. They would go to the ocean, something none of the children had ever seen, something Grace had only experienced once as a child. They took the train to San Francisco, spent a night in the city with Thomas and Eleanor, then traveled by carriage to the coast. When the children first saw the Pacific Ocean, their reactions were everything Ethan had hoped for. Benjamin, now 8 years old and serious-minded, stood and stared for a full minute before asking how far the water went. Lucy and Emma, 6 and identical, except for a small birthmark on Lucy's left shoulder, immediately ran toward the waves, shrieking with delight. Michael, only 2, was more cautious, holding tight to Grace's hand, but leaning forward with obvious curiosity. Ethan and Grace walked along the beach while the children explored under Eleanor's watchful eye. The sun was setting, turning the water gold and orange. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked. "This life we have built?" "Never. When you came to my gate that first day, I thought you were just bringing bad news. I never dreamed you were bringing a new future." "Do you think Rebecca knew? Really knew?" "I think she hoped. And I think wherever she is glad it worked out the way it did." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. At 35 years old, and she was even more beautiful than she had been at 25. Motherhood and happiness had given her a glow that no amount of expensive clothes or cosmetics could replicate. "I love you, Ethan Cole, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. I love you too, and I am grateful every single day that you walked through that gate." They stood on the beach holding hands, watching their children play at the edge of the continent. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in brilliant colors. It was a perfect moment, the kind you wanted to capture and keep forever. That night in the hotel room where they were staying, Ethan lay awake listening to his family breathe. Grace beside him sleeping soundly. The children in the adjoining room restless but content. This was what Rebecca had wanted for him. This fullness, this joy, this life. And suddenly Ethan was no longer 34 years old lying in a hotel bed. He was 72, sitting on a porch in Wyoming, watching the last light fade from the sky. Samuel, his grandson, was looking at him with wide eyes. "That is an incredible story, Grandpa." Ethan blinked, coming back to the present. "It is a true story, every word of it. So the woman in the photograph, Grandma Grace, she really did come to forgive you and Grandma Rebecca." "She did. And in doing so, she gave me a second chance at life, at happiness, at everything. Do you still miss Grandma Rebecca?" It was a perceptive question from a boy of 15. Ethan considered it carefully before answering. "I do. There is a part of my heart that will always belong to her, to the young man I was when I loved her, to the dreams we had together. But that does not diminish what I have with your Grandma Grace. Love is not a finite resource, Samuel. The heart is capable of holding many loves, many truths all at the same time. Did you ever regret it, marrying Grandma Grace? Not for a single day, not for a single moment. Even though people must have talked, oh, they talked, for years some of them talked. But the people who mattered understood, and the ones who did not understand well, their opinions did not change the truth of what Grace and I had." Samuel was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he asked, "What happened to the letters, the ones Grandma Rebecca wrote?" "Your Grandma Grace kept them. They are in a box in our bedroom, along with Rebecca's diary. We read them sometimes when we want to remember. They are not painful anymore. They are just part of our story." "And Grandma Grace, she is really still here." As if summoned by the question, the screen door opened. Grace Cole, now 65 years old, stepped onto the porch. Her hair was silver, her face lined with the passage of years, but her eyes were still that remarkable blue-green, and they still lit up when she looked at Ethan. "Are you two going to sit out here all evening? Dinner is ready." Samuel jumped up. Grandpa was just telling me the most amazing story." Grace smiled, coming to stand beside Ethan's chair. She rested her hand on his shoulder, a gesture so natural and familiar that Ethan barely noticed it, though he felt the warmth of it down to his bones. "Was it the story of how we met?" "Yes, about the letters and forgiveness and everything." "Did he tell you the important parts about how stubborn he was? how long it took him to admit he had feelings for me. Hey now, Ethan protested mildly. I was being respectful. You were being stubborn, Grace corrected, but her tone was affectionate, just like you still are. Samuel laughed, and the sound was so much like his father's Ethan's son, Benjamin, that it made Ethan's chest tight with emotion. Come on, Samuel, Grace said. Let your grandfather rest. He has been talking for hours. Actually, Grandma, I wanted to ask you something. Grandpa said Grandma Rebecca gave you permission to marry him, in her letters. But what did you think? Were you scared? Grace looked down at Ethan, and something passed between them, an entire conversation in a glance. Then she looked back at Samuel. Terrified. Loving your grandfather meant going against everything I had been taught about propriety and what was acceptable. It meant facing judgment and gossip. It meant living with the fear that I was betraying my sister. But it also meant being happier than I had ever been in my life. And Rebecca, in her wisdom, understood that happiness should not be wasted. So you would do it all again, even knowing how hard it would be. In a heartbeat, Grace said firmly. Love like what your grandfather and I found it does not come along often. When it does, you hold on to it with both hands and do not let go no matter what anyone else thinks. Samuel nodded, processing this. I hope I find something like that someday. You will, Ethan said. When you are ready and when the time is right. Just remember the heart knows things the mind does not. Trust it. They went inside for dinner, the three of them, and the house was filled with the warm light of lamps and the smell of Grace's cooking. Over the meal, they talked about Samuel's plans for university, about the ranch and how it would be managed while Ethan got older, about family in the future. After Samuel went to bed, Ethan and Grace sat together in the parlor. On the mantel was the photograph Samuel had asked about, the one showing Ethan with both Rebecca and Grace. It had been taken at a family gathering years ago. A clever bit of photography that superimposed Rebecca's image from an old photograph with a new one of Ethan and Grace. It was Grace's way of keeping Rebecca present in their family, of honoring the woman who had made their love possible. Do you think we did right by her? Grace asked softly. By Rebecca. I think we did exactly what she hoped we would do. We lived, we loved, we built a family and a life. We honored her memory without being trapped by it. I still talk to her sometimes when I am alone. I tell her about the children, about you, about our life. What do you think she says back? Grace smiled. I think she says she is proud of us, that we took her gift and did not waste it. Ethan stood and extended his hand. Come to bed, Mrs. Cole. Grace took his hand and they walked together to the bedroom they had shared for 38 years. The bed where 4 children had been conceived. The room where they had laughed and argued and made up and grown old together. As Ethan drifted off to sleep, Grace's hand in his, he thought about the long, strange journey that had brought him here. From a grief-stricken widower to a husband and father. From a man who thought he would never love again to a man surrounded by love. Rebecca had been his first love, and he would never forget her. But Grace was his enduring love, his partner, his completion. And somehow, impossibly, both truths could exist at the same time. The next morning, Ethan woke early as he always did, even though his ranching days were mostly behind him now. He made coffee and sat on the porch watching the sun rise over land that had been his home for more than 40 years. Samuel found him there an hour later. Grandpa, I have been thinking about your story all night. Oh, you said Grandma Rebecca wrote in her diary that she hoped you and Grandma Grace would find each other. That she left so you could be happy. That is a really selfless thing. It was. But it was also kind of sad. She gave up her own happiness for yours. Ethan nodded slowly. It was sad. Rebecca's story was a tragedy in many ways. But Samuel here is what I have learned in 72 years of living. Sometimes the best we can do is make sure our suffering leads to someone else's joy. Rebecca could not save herself, but she could give us the tools to save each other. And in doing so, she gave meaning to her pain. I think I understand. It is like her life mattered because of what it made possible for you and Grandma Grace. Exactly. And that is why we never forgot her. Why we kept her photograph, her letters, her memory alive. Because she was part of this family, part of this story, even in her absence. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, when I go to university in the fall, when I start my new life, I am going to remember this. That sometimes the hardest things lead to the best things. That love is worth fighting for even when it is complicated. That forgiveness can open doors you did not even know existed. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Those are good lessons, Samuel. The best ones I know. Grace came out then carrying a tray with breakfast for all three of them. They ate together on the porch, three generations of the Cole family bound together by love and loss and the determination to make something good from both. As Samuel prepared to leave later that morning, heading back to his parents' house in town, Ethan pulled him aside. You asked me earlier if I ever regretted marrying your grandma Grace. I want to make sure you understand my answer. Regret is about wishing things had been different, but I would not change a single thing about my life, Samuel. Not Rebecca, not the pain of losing her, not the years I spent alone. Because all of it, every moment of joy and sorrow led me to Grace, led me to your father and aunts, led me to you. And that journey, painful as parts of it were, was worth every step. Samuel hugged him a fierce embrace that spoke of understanding beyond his years. Thank you for telling me the story, Grandpa. I will remember it, always. After Samuel left, Ethan returned to the porch where Grace was waiting. She had brought out the box that held Rebecca's letters and diary, and they sat together looking through the old papers. Do you remember that first day, Grace asked, when I showed up at your gate with these? I remember thinking you were going to bring nothing but trouble into my life. I did bring trouble. The best kind of trouble. Ethan kissed her forehead. 38 years, Grace. 38 years, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. Only because you know me better now. You know all my flaws. I know you are stubborn and opinionated, and you never admit when you are wrong. Pot calling the kettle black, Mr. Cole. And I know you are brilliant and brave, and you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. I know our children are incredible because of you. I know I am a better man because of you. I know that loving you was the smartest thing I ever did. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. We were lucky, were not we, to find this, to have this. Lucky, blessed, whatever you want to call it. Yes. They sat together in the morning sun, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a life that neither had imagined possible. Around them, the ranch hummed with quiet activity, cattle in the distance, birds singing in the trees, the wind moving through the grass. It was just another morning in a life full of mornings. But it was also a gift each day, a reminder that forgiveness and love and second chances were real and possible, and worth every struggle it took to find them. Rebecca's photograph looked down at them from the mantel inside, frozen forever, at 27, beautiful and tragic and ultimately generous. And if they listened carefully, they could almost hear her voice on the wind saying what she had written in that final diary entry so long ago. Love should not be wasted, and Ethan has so much love to give. Grace had received that love had nurtured, it had built a family and a life with it. And in doing so, she had honored Rebecca's final gift in the best way possible, by being happy, by being grateful, by living fully and loving deeply and never taking a single day for granted. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, and in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be.